Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. And in this series of episodes, we're talking a little bit about the story of Native Americans and how they have affected this area, who they were, and some of the conflicts that unfortunately took place over a long period of time. In the first episode, we talked a little bit about how the initial Spanish came into contact with Indians of this area. This, of course, was the story of Cabeza de Vaca and the period of 1528, the coming of the De Soto expedition and people, how they encountered the Coosa tribe, and of course De Luna's encounter with Indians, which might have been much more successful had time been on his side. And then of course we move forward to the time of the coming of the Tallahassee mission, a little bit about story about the fact that there were very few Indians here when the second Spanish expedition began in about 1700, and how the French were a little more fortunate than the Spanish because there were more Native Americans close to Mobile and Biloxi, and the friendships that grew there made the French allies of what became what we now know as the Chacabos and also the Pensacolas, smaller tribes that were allied with the French along with the Creeks. Okay, last time we brought the story up to about the year 1810. By now the Indian territories, which had been set aside by treaty in 1783, were being violated by settlers coming west out of Georgia. This was leading to conflict between the Creeks, Cherokees, Choctaws, and of course the Georgians themselves, and of course more very logically the Georgia settlers were calling upon the national government in Washington to help them, and this was violating the treaty, but not step by step this was actually happening. So by the time we get to the year 1812, 13, 14, when the so-called War of 1812 was in progress, the next major thing that we see locally here was an effort by British officers, now two of them in particular, Captain Woodbine and Colonel Nichols, to come into Florida and to try and get the Native Americans who lived nearby to side with the British to help them with an invasion of the American Southeast. And of course the Indians were some of them were willing, some of them were not. The British of course also tried to literally encourage slaves to run away from their masters to become a part of the British contingent, and all of this was part of the story. And there was some identification of the Indian tribes with the British as they planned for this invasion. Well, of course, an invasion that never really happened because General Andrew Jackson had moved south and pretty well stopped it. Okay, we moved just a year or so beyond that, and now the next step that took place involving Indians was a very short one, but it put Andrew Jackson in a position that he became I guess we'd have to call him an Indian fighter. By now we're we've just beyond the War of 1812, and now we see further incursion of the Georgians and others into what we now call Alabama, putting their settlements there and in lower Alabama. And the American Army, now to protect citizens of that area, built a fort about where Bruton is, or East Bruton is today, and they called Fort Crawford. And that was to be a kind of a defense point because the people in Washington realized that conflict was coming, it was almost inevitable, and sure enough, it happened. By the time we reach this period, the Indian the Indian tribes have become so incensed at the theft of their territory that they are plotting ways to do something about it. And one of the stories that's involved us here in Pensacola comes when a group of Indians, they say, the story goes that there were about 200 of them, literally coming down the military road, and they arrived in Pensacola, and they go to the Spanish governor and to Mr. Forbes, Thomas Forbes, who was then running the old Panton-Leslie trading post, which now of course is called Forbes. And these Indians come and they say, "We demand from you arms and munitions and powder. Well, the governor said, well, I can't accommodate you. We have none. Our army, all we've got is a tiny supply here for our little militia. And by the time they were through, the Forbes company agreed that to keep these 200 people from running amok in the community, they gave them about 2,000 pounds of powder, which the Indians put on pack horses and began to move north. Well, that night or the night after, I'm not quite sure which, they settled down for the night along an area up not far from where Bruton is today called Burnt Corn Creek. They settled in there, and it was at that point that one of the first actual conflicts, the physical conflicts, occurs between a small militia that the Alabama settlers had put together and the Indians, and we have the Battle of Burnt Corn Creek. A little bit later on, of course, the Indians now are rising up. They are certain that bad things are going to happen to them, and so as a result of that, there are threats. And so, at a point in the latter part of this period, the threat is so great that about 500 settlers who had been in Mason and Brooklyn and places like that in lower Alabama flee together inside the protection of Fort Mims. Almost 550 of them get in there, and then comes the Indian attack, and it is a savage attack. But the story goes that more than 500 of these settlers are massacred inside the fort. Well, when that happened, of course, the governor of Tennessee said, well, we must have redress. We can't have this. And now he, in turn, assigns General Andrew Jackson, who, of course, has already had some experience here in Florida, assigns him and his troop to come south and do battle with the Indians. And they come face to face in a battle that it comes down in history as being the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. This is where General Jackson faces an Indian tribal group led by Billy Weatherford. It's a terrible struggle, and the Indians are thoroughly defeated. Within a couple of days, a sit-down occurs, and a treaty is signed between Jackson acting for the United States and the Creek Indians, and the Creeks literally cede about 2 million acres of what had been their tribal land by treaty, cede this to the United States. And of course, this is the first real step for the large numbers of Creeks and others beginning to move to the west beyond the Mississippi. Well, as all of this is happening, of course, some of the Creeks realize what is happening. They know that the time has come where they have their power has been broken, and so a good many of them decide that the thing to do is to move to the east and come to join a group down in Central and South Florida known as the Seminoles, and that they would find greater protection there. And so this does indeed begin to happen. Not huge numbers, but some of those who had been in Central Alabama do make that move. Now, as that is happening, a sort of a sidelight event takes place. This is when, of course, in the year 1817, a group of brigands, a little pirate, might well call them pirates, out of New Orleans, set up what they called the Indian Fort, or some of them called it the Negro Fort, over near Apalachicola. And their prospect was to slip into the Alabama territory and steal slaves, bring them south, and transport them to New Orleans and resell them. Well, as this is happening, of course, the Alabama planters protest, and so the governor of the U.S. government again assigns Mr. Jackson to go in and clean this up. And they do. They march, even though this is Spanish territory, this American force moves in, literally captures the fort, captures the brigands, sends those slaves that are there back to their owners. And then one of the commanders of the Jackson force, a man named William King, said, well, you know, this could not have happened if the Seminoles had not been involved as well. So at this point in time, Mr. Jackson, with his force of well over 1,000 men, marches a little bit further to the east, and they do encounter a Seminole encampment there. And Mr. Jackson in his report said, and basically his language was, we spanked the Seminoles there. Well, Mr. Jackson, of course, after that moves back to Nashville. A little bit later on, he is assigned to become the first governor of Florida, and he does. He comes in, and it is in 1821. Mr. Jackson presides over the exchange of flags, and we become a territory. Florida becomes a territory of the United States. Well, as all of this is happening now, what is happening to the Native Americans? Well, A good many of them have been forced to flee or to move across the Mississippi into reservation status in places like Oklahoma. Now there are some who entered into negotiations and had been friendly to the Americans, and they are given local status and they stay here, and they put together tribal units in South Alabama, a little bit in North Florida, and they become permanent residents and remain so today. So that is basically what we see in the tribal unit and the successful enterprise that has been started now in and around the Atmore area. Well, beyond this, of course, we come into the period of the 1830s. All across Florida, we fortunately not in Pensacola, but all across Florida, there are a number of uprisings in which the Seminoles are involved. And while that is not Pensacola story per se, I have to just throw this into the overall tale, that we go through a period of about 10 years, which are known as the Seminole Wars in Florida. They are dragged out. They're very unfortunate incidents. Ultimately, of course, most of the Seminoles are defeated. The balance of them retreat into the Everglades and remain in a civilization there. Well, as all of this is taking place, of course, Pensacola is settling down. One of the things that is kind of remarkable as we see the community itself develop is that as the city council proceeds in developing a form of government here, by the time we get into the 1830s, a number of the ordinances that are passed deal with the kind of commerce that local merchants are allowed to have with Native Americans. It is basically verboten. It is against the law for a man of commerce here to sell alcohol in any form to the Indians. And there is a set of ordinances that set up what the Indians may do when they're in Pensacola and where they may go. And so this is a very limiting factor for the Native Americans who are still nearby while they are not, of course, part of Pensacola itself. Well, the last real story we have of a Native American of that period comes to us not as part of what was going on in Alabama or between the Seminoles and the United States Army, but rather something that happened as a result of the wars out in the far west, particularly in Arizona. And that is where, of course, the great Apache chief Geronimo has been deeply involved. And as we move into the 1880s, that war comes to a climax and Geronimo was captured. Quite frankly, it appears as though the United States government didn't quite know what to do with Geronimo and his followers. But basically what did happen was that the chief, along with his wives and several number of his sub-chiefs, are moved out of Arizona. They travel to the east and ultimately are imprisoned in Fort Pickens. And this is where Geronimo is for well over a year. The story is kind of interesting. They say Geronimo, of course, was a tourist attraction. The people in the town would literally employ small vessels to take them out there so they could see this Indian chief and see what he was like and what he did. And of course, Geronimo was a showman. He developed a practice of literally selling the buttons off his coat to people who were interested. Each week, I guess his wives had to quickly stitch on some more buttons because he sold a lot of them. But people came in large numbers to see this last great American and what he had done. The story was, of course, that some people feared that this might lead to some sort of greater new insurrection, but of course that did not happen. Well, summarizing then, our story of Native Americans is that Pensacola itself was never a great headquarters. There are small evidences that they were here. We know the archaeologists have unearthed all kinds of things, Indian burial mounds of that kind, in which the remnants of the Indian housekeeping are present. But it is pretty obvious that even though the Native Americans were throughout the Southeast, perhaps for as long as 10,000 years before Columbus arrived, this was not a hub of Indian culture, not a home for a large tribe, but there were interactions beginning with Cabeza de Vaca and carrying us all the way through to the 21st century. So basically that's our story. I wish I could give you a little more precise story, but basically that's the way it fit into the story of Pensacola, North America's first place city.